Hey, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, wherever you are. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes here. Uh, Go ahead and put in the chat box where you're calling in from today. We'd love to see where you all are. We have an international audience today, so please feel free to tell us where you're calling in from. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll get started here in just a second. There is a lot of people that signed up for this webinar, so I want to make sure that as many people as possible are getting in here.
Yeah, people from all over the US and Canada so far.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, let's get started because we want the full time. We want as much time for questions as possible. All right. Welcome to the Veritas Group webinar, Demystifying Donor Advised Funds. I'm Jeff Schreifels, and I'm the principal and owner here at Veritas. And we have a great panel today. Really smart people today to answer all of your questions. And I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions, but before we dive in, I want to make sure you know how to use our webinar system. Now, because of the number, there's so many of us today, we aren't able to take your questions out loud, but your questions are really important. So please put them in the Q&A box as we go along. Don't put them in the chat box unless you are chatting with one of our esteemed guests at the time. Put your questions in the Q&A so that I can then take them and put them out to our guests. And I'll be working through those to address as many of those questions as possible. Now, as I said already, we have an international audience here, so I wanted to also note that you can turn on the translated captions and select your preferred language in your Zoom settings. And just so you know, we'll be sending you a link to a recording of this webinar and a copy of the slide deck tomorrow. So let's get started with our introductions. I've already introduced myself, and so I don't need to do anything. How about you, Diana? Let's talk.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm on the Veritas team, been on the team for 11 and a half years. Was a frontline fundraiser myself in the shoes of many of you for 32 years. Worked in a lot of different areas, and I continue as a board member of a small nonprofit here in Philadelphia. So yes, I'm still asking donors to invest in change.
All right. Evan.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation. As you can see, I'm with Bernstein Private Wealth. I lead the nonprofit and foundation practice. So I work with many families who have family foundations and donor advised funds, as well as many of you and your organizations, and how to align your investments with the objectives and mission of your organization. From South Jersey, but coming to you from our offices in Philadelphia. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you for being here. Fernando.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Fernando Gonzalez with National Philanthropic Trust. You may be familiar with National Philanthropic Trust because we're not only a donor advised fund administrator, but we also publish the DAF report on an annual basis, which I know many of you may leverage in some of your marketing efforts. So really excited to be with you today. Originally from Colorado, been in Philadelphia now for currently snowing Philadelphia for about 22 years now, where I make my home in South Philadelphia. I'm really excited to be with you. I'm a recovering opera singer, as you see down below, and also a recovering wealth advisor. So have a pretty unique perspective of putting those two sides of my brain together as we work through bringing the assets from many of the donors you work with into the sector and really trying to affect the causes that the donors would like to support. So excited to be with you today.
Awesome. Thank you for being here. Andrew.
Thanks, Jeff. Andrew Bobbitt, Major Gift Officer for Mercy Ships, overseeing donors in the Northeast across 7 states. Prior to that, had spent 27 years with the YMCA in various roles across the country. Decided to take off my hat as CEO and focus now specifically on development. Very much enjoying that work within Mercy Ships and appreciate being here on a great subject.
Yeah. Thank you all for being here. Now, before we get started on today's topic, I just wanted to share a bit about who we are at Veritas. Some of you on the call may be pretty familiar with us, but for those who aren't, we are passionately relationship focused and grounded in a data-driven approach. And this dynamic is critical to the system, structure, and strategy that we have found to be successful in mid, major, and plan giving programs. Something that I recognized during my time in the direct response world is that data is powerful. So when we found that most major gift programs were missing this critical piece, we knew it had to be a part of our approach to major gifts. And over the last several years, we've had the opportunity to work with thousands of major gift officers, mid-level officers, and plan giving officers, many on a weekly basis through our consulting work. So we know firsthand how this approach has helped organizations of all sizes and focuses created to create authentic donor relationships that lead to a stronger donor pipeline and greater net revenue. Also, the lack of data was really concerning, and it still amazes us how many nonprofits do not adequately consider the data piece of this work. And that's why we've worked so hard to ground our approach in objective fact, not just our personal opinion. And we formed our recommendations through the insight of analysis of millions of donor records and the work with thousands of fundraisers and leaders. And we've gotten to work with some pretty phenomenal organizations over the years who have helped us learn and develop our strategy and approach. Now, before we get to some of the top submitted questions and take your questions live, we wanted to give some additional information about DAFs. Firstly, there is a massive opportunity within donor advised funds, which Fernando will share about. And as most of you know, the amount of money put into a DAF each year from donors has grown exponentially. But the opportunity is not about just creating a DAF strategy. The opportunity is really understanding your donors' passions and interests, their communication preferences, and how they like to make their gifts: outright cash, stocks, property, or through a DAF. Before you go down a road of trying to focus on DAFs as a key part of your fundraising strategy this year, there are a few things you need to keep in mind. The first thing to remember is that the money in the DAF has already been given. So there's an incredible opportunity to work with donors to identify a transformational giving opportunity that you might not be able to do through a standard giving means. And also, you do not need a special strategy to make an ask that involves a DAF. Don't get hung up on the idea that you do. What you do need is an inspiring offer that has vision to ask transformationally, and then to have the tools to talk to your donor about how they can give through their DAF. But the process is the same. You report back on the impact your donor is already making through their giving. You're authentically asking permission to learn more about the donor's giving strategies, including if they have a DAF, and match the donor's interests with opportunities for them to give and to be part of the solution. We'll go into this more as we take your questions, but there are a few things to think about as you consider how to maximize DAF giving in your organization. First, you must have a compelling offer to present to your donors. This is a must for all major giving, but it's especially helpful when you want to have a conversation with your donor about giving transformationally. One of the easiest things to do is simply make it very clear that your organization can make these kind of gifts. And as with all giving, especially in mid-level and major gifts, you must report back promptly. Now, I know there can be challenges with all of this, but you have to do what you can do to show that the donor that they're really making a difference. So, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Fernando.
Yeah, thank you. And I thought it would be a really good moment for us to maybe take a quick step back and really just level set, be sure we're all speaking the same language when it comes to donor advised funds. But donor advised funds are essentially a sub-account of a 501c3 organization administrator. So essentially what that means is it creates an opportunity for a donor to give an asset to the donor advised fund, whether that be cash, marketable securities, cryptocurrency, something more complex in nature, to then be able to live and breathe within the donor advised fund until such time as the donor would like to then be able to affect the causes that they would. That can be on day 2 of the account opening, all the way up until 6 months or a year down the road as they're building out their strategy. Where the rubber meets the road here, in many cases, I will tell you, and while some people would use a donor advised fund for their everyday giving to really consolidate their giving into one vehicle, that way their gift receipts are all in one place. But it also could be used when a donor is having a windfall year. Maybe they've received a big bonus, they have they're selling a business, or maybe they're just trying to monetize an asset that might be on their books, and they're working with charities that may not have the operational or legal bandwidth to accept those themselves. So they might leverage a donor advised fund in that left-hand column there where the donors are contributing. That then helps to monetize that and becomes a lot more of an agile way for them to give from their donor advised fund to the 501c3s in the United States or internationally through their donor advised fund. So I will leverage this from a competitor, but the give and the grow and the grant. Essentially, it's a way for them to allow for these assets to be given to a charitable entity, a 501c3, the DAF administrator in this case, and then be able to separate that deduction from their ultimate grant making down the line. So we'll move on to the next slide here. I think it'd just be helpful for you to understand a little bit more of the entire landscape of the donor advised fund world. So as I mentioned earlier, National Philanthropic Trust, we release our DAF report on an annual basis, and you'll see that this data at the bottom says that it's coming from the 2024 report, which all of that is very delayed by about a year because what we're using to gather this data are the 990s of the charities that are administering donor advised funds. And as you might imagine, fiscal years don't always match up. So a lot of this data has to be reconciled in a very deliberate manner. So we have a team behind the scenes that works on this. They publish it, and then the next day they're starting on the next one just to be sure that they can get it all up and running. But what this has really revealed for you, especially as fundraisers, is that the DAF donors are coming from a range of wealth levels. These are not just billionaires leveraging a donor advised fund. And what's really nice about that is many of the donor advised fund administrators out in the land in our industry have lowered the minimums and the entry points, some even having no minimum. You can open a donor advised fund with any amount into the donor advised fund to allow for you to leverage the donor advised fund platform for your giving and your donors to do the same. What's also interesting, and I think this is something that you should definitely just keep at the forefront of your mind, is that the average DAF size in the United States right now is $141,000. So what does that mean? What the flag that puts up in my own head as someone who sits on some boards and also wants to help other organizations fundraise is that if you receive that DAF gift, which DAF gifts, I just got a note here that the average grant size in the United States is anywhere between $10,000 and $50,000. So if we think about the checks that you're receiving on a regular basis, it likely will signal that there is more in that account for you to go and appeal to that particular donor. And we'll talk about some of those tips here in a second, but $141,000 being the average DAF size. And then that DAF donors, they are active philanthropists. They are granting out on average more than 20% of their account's value on an annual basis. I've in my time here at NPT and my time reading this report, I've not seen that number go below 20% in that time period. So I'm going on 7 years now at NPT, and of that time frame, over 20% of the assets on an average basis are flowing out of donor advised funds. What's nice about that is when you think about that in contrast to the private foundation world, where many of times that 5% becomes the power of suggestion, and they're like, well, let's go ahead and send out our 5% because that's what we're required to do. Of course, we know many other donors are very philanthropic and giving more than that, but that power of suggestion becomes very strong when it comes to putting that requirement out there. And then these are the very same donors that you are currently cultivating. We want to be able to underscore that they are the donors. These are the contacts, the folks that you want to be reaching out to, because they are the ones ultimately making that decision to recommend that grant from their donor advised fund. So while you may be able to reach out to Evan and all of his peers in the wealth advisory world, the juice and the squeeze are going to come from the donors themselves, because another piece here in this last bullet here is that we as the DAF administrators and many wealth advisors are remaining agnostic. They're looking to fulfill the donors' wishes, and that's what we're trying to do by way. So you should be cultivating the DAF donors themselves, because they are the ones that ultimately hit that button to recommend those grants.
Yeah. Fernando, before you jump on, there's a question that's tied to that. From Charles, I'm reading over here, what incentives do DAF administrators have to encourage DAF owners to disperse their accounts?
So some will have policy that's actually built into that, where, and we at NPT, we have a policy that a grant must be made out of every DAF account at least every 30 months. But from an incentive standpoint, there are various incentives dependent upon the industry and the actual DAF administrator. Some may offer matching programs, some may offer other means through which they will incentivize a donor for giving more from their donor advised fund. But generally speaking, I would say that dangling an incentive carrot in front of a donor doesn't really exist much in the industry, but we are most certainly trying to find ways to bring out messaging to the donors saying, here's a way that in a very responsive way, you can give to these particular causes that are affected, like, for example, the wildfires, being sure that they have the necessary resources to understand where they, as the donor, as they might be seeking an opportunity to give in a particular way that they're not used to, have a resource that's going to be readily available for them.
Thanks.
Sure. So just continuing on the conversation around donor advised funds and kind of demystifying them, obviously we know that in 2023, the numbers here are $54.77 billion started flowing out of were flowing out of donor advised funds. You could see that that's actually a slight dip. Contributions into donor advised funds over that same period were also down, but actually the contributions were down much more than the grants. So 21% was the decrease in contributions between 2022 and 2023 and contribution side. The dip that happened in the grants was 1.4%. So you can see that the grant making continued to be robust even with the dip in the contributions, meaning that donors were still able to be responsive to the charities they would like to support, but also to sustain their grant making over time, which becomes, we've put out several reports not only about donor advised funds continuing to be available, especially in down markets or recessions, or especially in times right now when there's a lot of uncertainty around funding sources. These funds are already set aside for a charitable purpose and are readily available for these appeals that the fundraisers can certainly be bringing to their donors directly. And let's see if I think I've touched on a lot of this here, but with regard to the donor advised funds, DAF grant values have increased 92% since 2019. So if you think about what was happening in 2019, but what happened in 2020, obviously we had COVID, we started seeing folks really start to bring philanthropy to the forefront of their conversations, not just obviously by way of healthcare, but we've started to see that smooth back out from the sectors that are being supported by donor advised funds. Obviously in 2020, 2021, we saw a bit of a dip in the arts, for example, but of course that's largely in response to COVID and folks really trying to lean more into healthcare giving. We did see that started to smooth back out. The arts rebounded, at least I'm sure many arts organizations are on here thinking, well, not enough, but of course we would love to see that number continues to smooth out. Education and the arts most certainly rebounded there as well. But continue to remind yourselves that DAFs are a responsive tool for your donors, but also a sustainable source for them. The recurring grant piece is very important, reminding them that they can do that. And that actually leads us to this next slide here, a couple of the tips here. We did a collaboration with a couple of organizations that many of you use for your own CRMs a couple of years ago. And these are the 5 tips that we really wanted to bring to the fore to this conversation for you as fundraisers and for you as organizations, not just as the fundraisers, but others in your organization who might start to think of donor advised funds in a different way that can help you to build your appeals. So first and foremost, communicate with your donors how you will credit these grants. We're going to have a slide here later talking about soft credit versus hard credit, but again, hard credit is going to go to the DAF administrator, but that soft credit, be sure that these donors, when you know who they are getting that credit in your CRM so you can understand what their history of giving has been for you, other ways. Be sure that whomever is opening that check at your organization can identify in that top left-hand corner, does that come from National Philanthropic Trust? Yes. But then in that memo line and on that grant letter, does it give you information around who this donor is, what's their name? Sometimes they can even ask to send along their address and other contact information if you don't already have it. And that's a nice way for you to kind of build that into your system. If you find a way to build into your CRM that this grant came from a donor advised fund, again, as I was mentioning earlier, that will signal to you that there's very likely more where that came from, and that can become a sustainable way for that donor to give to your organization.
Okay.
In your appeals, whether they be direct appeals or even on your website, signaling that you can make it easy for this donor to support your organization by saying, if you're giving from your donor advised fund, here's the information you would need to input that into the system. That can make it a lot easier there for the donor as well. That signals your understanding as an organization that this is how they might like to give, but also starts the dialogue with that particular donor. Cultivating these DAF donors for planned gifts, reminding your organization that not donor advised funds can, of course, become sustainable. They can do monthly, quarterly, yearly giving, but many of them will also have legacy plans where they can name your organization as the charitable beneficiary to these funds when they pass, similar to an IRA or other retirement account. The funds that are there can be paid out to your organization, and again, signals that you have a good understanding of all of the bells and whistles that might go into a donor advised fund, and you can be a part of all of that. And engage with the family of the DAF donors, because if they don't name a charitable beneficiary, perhaps they're naming these other folks in the family to take over the philanthropic journey for the family. So being sure that you're probably already doing this, but being sure that you're connecting with Gen 2, Gen 3 to understand and be sure that they know who you are, and that you're an organization that means a lot to Gen 1, that it's another way that you can continue to have some support from that family after the passing of that particular donor. And then finally, partnering with your DAF donors your DAF sponsors for complex gift administration. So your gift acceptance policy is what it is. You probably revisit it every couple of years to see what your bandwidth could be to accept specific types of gifts. But if there are gifts that most certainly are something you cannot accept, you can work with your local community foundation or one of the national DAF providers that can help to monetize those gifts and then send you a check once that monetization event occurs. Obviously, there's plenty of organizations out there, donor advised funds, as well as organizations like Charitable Solutions that are out there doing this work all day, every day. But just know that there are many options out there to do this work, and all with the goal of moving these assets out into the charitable sector. So I speak
Awesome.
very quickly as my East Coast and my Puerto Rican tongue, so my apologies. So
You
I'm going to
were
pause there.
No, you're amazing. Thank you. Great information. Before we get into the questions from our attendees today, and there are a ton of them, and thank you already to our guests who've been answering some of these questions. We were submitted some questions in advance, and I want to go through those before we get into the live questions. The first one, I'm going to direct this to you, Fernando, is how do you find donors with donor advised funds? And, a lot of people are saying our board is encouraging us to target DAFs. And how do we educate the board members on how this really works?
I will tell you, just based on a lot of the numbers that we continue to see, if you're familiar at all with the DAF, I've got it right here, the DAF Research Collaborative, the Heist Vance study. They have they continue to build upon their study, looking for essentially trying to understand who are these DAF donors that are out there and how are they using their donor advised funds. If you haven't had a chance, it's the DAF RC Research Collaborative. Their report is available online. They're not affiliated with NPT, but a lot of really great data out there for you to chew through. I will tell you, a lot of their data is basically telling me that the donors you're working with already probably already do have a DAF. So your donors are probably leveraging a DAF either with you or other organizations, trying to understand who that is. For your prospective donors, again, assume that they also have a DAF. So it's no different than you going out and trying to solicit current donors or prospective donors. The one tip I can give you is something I mentioned earlier is whomever is opening the checks at your organization, be sure that they know what to look for on those checks to identify whether there are other assets that they might be able to inquire about with that donor that they can become a sustainable giver.
Yeah, and I would just like to add to that, Fernando. Of course, as a wealth advisor to many families who are charitable, they're setting up a donor advised fund as the vehicle in which they give. it's a charitable bank account or a charitable investment account to them, but they're the ones making the decision about where the funds go. And instead of writing a check or giving appreciated stock, because of some of the incentives around the donor advised fund and some of the things that you mentioned up front, they're using that as a vehicle. So it's really a vehicle. It's not a person making a decision. And certainly myself and Fernando, not to speak for you, but MPT, we're not advising the donor on where to give. It's the donor who must make the decision on where to give and process that. We're administering that. Of course, in my case, I'm helping them set up the investment plan so that can grow, so they can give more over time. But it's really about that person. And so, I do get a lot of nonprofits. I'm lucky enough to work with a lot of organizations that will come to me and say, I know you administer donor advised funds through Bernstein. How can I get in touch with your donors? And I am not the gatekeeper to those clients. There is a handful of clients that do come to me once or so a year, and they say, hey, we're looking to give in this space because we're working on their mission statement, or maybe their kids are getting involved, and so we're helping bring them into the fold. And so they might ask me for a couple organizations, and I certainly, have a system, but I'm not vetting, I'm not suggesting. I think that is very standard across the industry. And it's not because I don't want to. It's just not my role. It's not an attorney's role to do that work unless we're asked to do that. And it's certainly not a donor advised fund administrator's role to do that. Now, philanthropic advisors and others who are directly working with families to help them vet and give to organizations, that's a different story. And me as an individual, certainly, I'm philanthropic myself. I try to do as much as I can. But coming to Bernstein Private Wealth and giving us a presentation around your organization might be good for our advisor set to give personally, but to get to our clients, unfortunately, it's not. I put my director of development hat on, and I did the same thing, and I was just spinning my wheels because it was the wrong gatekeeper, because we have to get to the donor directly. And that's just like any major gift you're trying to go after, that's the way I would do it. So I just wanted to add that.
I'm glad you made that clear, because there's a lot of folks ask us about this, and our clients, maybe we need to have a relationship with all the Evans out there, and because they're the ones that are going to, talk to the donors about where they should give their gifts. But I'm glad you cleared that up, because there's some questions in here about this. What if you, Evan, don't like the nonprofit that the donor wants to give to? It's not up to you, right?
Yeah.
As long as it's a 501c3,
Yeah.
the donor can make that gift. It's their ability to do that. And again, if they call on us, sure, I'm always happy to pass along some names that I know. But that is very rarely happens. And it's coming from, of course, a place that I want to empower my clients to give more. That's why I'm suggesting a donor advised fund, or a way for them to express their values. But it's not the role that I have to help them then get the money out the door, except to empower them, to show them that they can do that.
Yeah. And to piggyback on that, because you brought up, Evan, the philanthropic advisor, and Fernando, I know we've talked about that with you before. That's a different animal. Those philanthropic advisory organizations, their job is to, if say Fernando comes to me and says, I really care about hunger, and I'm the philanthropic advisor, I'm going to do the background research. That's a different story. But they also don't want you as an organization coming after them. They are very skilled at what they do. They will find the organizations, and you'll know if there's a philanthropic advisor involved, because suddenly you're going to get an information form to fill out that's pretty intense.
Yeah. Okay. Next question here. Diane, I'm going to direct this one to you. And I think this came up already, but let's talk a little bit more.
Yeah, and it's been in the chat too. You want to hard credit the gift to the donor advised fund. That's the entity that tipped the gift. The donor already received their tax credit from the donor advised fund. However, what you do want to do is that soft credit, think of it as a dotted line, so that you can take those gifts from Fidelity or National Philanthropic Trust, Silicon, whatever it is, and make that record on the donor's account that it's a soft credit. So they won't get a receipt from you, but you can see the giving history and you're able to speak intelligently with the donor. And you can say, Andrew, thank you so much for your incredibly generous support through the years. And I know that you sometimes use your donor advised fund. I want to still report to you on the impact of that gift. That's the difference. If you don't do that hard work of the soft credit, you start losing a big part of the picture of a donor. And I think that answers a bunch of questions in the chat there, Jeff.
Okay.
Or not chat, in the Q&A box.
I'll try to keep up with it.
Yeah, that's not the
Right.
Q&A box is exploded.
Okay, next question, and I'm going to direct this one to Evan. Should we be engaging the wealth advisors? We kind of already talked about this, but I'd love to get your take further.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the comments of just being strategic around those professionals that you're engaging with. Again, I don't think zero would be helpful, but I think you have to really understand the person's practice, what they've given, their personal connections with things. So I think that's a big piece. So again, putting my director of development hat and my experience as an advisor to families and organizations, it's making the case as if they're an individual, because that individual or that family is the one who is going to give. The DAF is the vehicle in which they give from. And so I think there was a couple of questions in the chat, which may be helpful around how they give or can they give multi-year gifts, etc. Yes, because it's just like them being it is them being an individual. So you can ask those questions. And I would ask your donors, as I think Jeff said or Fernando said, they likely have a DAF. So asking the question, how do you usually give, is a great way to understand whether they have a DAF or a foundation or et cetera if they haven't given before. And if they're giving by check or even by stock but have a DAF, that's good for you to know as well, and good to encourage them to give through that donor advised fund where that money is already earmarked to give to nonprofits.
Okay. All right, next question, and we'll direct this to Andrew. Are there seasons or times of year when a DAF appeals are more effective?
That's a great question. I mean, and I probably look at it a little bit differently than some in terms of seasons, because I think it's such a great giving vehicle and such a great opportunity throughout the year that it's really a year-round conversation for me that I have. I've got donors. I'm in New York. I wish I was back behind me here, but I've got donors in Manhattan, and I've got donors in Mennonite communities in Pennsylvania. And I don't assume that either one has an Evan that is going to educate them on DAFs. I also want to make sure that I am confident and that they understand the organization that they're choosing to support is a sophisticated organization that understands how best they can leverage the donation for personal and us organizationally to support the mission that they're choosing to support. So for me, it's education throughout the year. This time of year, I've had conversations today, in fact, and we'll get to the anonymous portion of this, where donors didn't get their name associated with a gift that got logged for me in Texas. And so the follow-up to that was making sure that we got the soft credit to the donor and tracking that down. But 40% of my gifts come in November and December. So I can tell you November 1st, one of those educational opportunities is if you want to give through the DAF vehicle. And that's a little friendly reminder that there's some lag time in giving that DAF gift, and to make sure if they want it in by year end to get that process started ideally in November and not December 30th.
Yeah, one of the best things you can do there is just ask the donor, when do you and your family come together to make these kinds of decisions? I'd love to make sure I get you information that you want when you need it. That's a fantastic opportunity for a conversation.
Exactly. All right, Fernando. What do you feel is the best way to market a DAF giving to our donors to encourage them to give them this way?
Yeah, I'll start with this one, but I think that most certainly everybody else can chime in. I think it's, as I was mentioning earlier, the ways to identify them in the first place is really going to be the key. I see a lot of questions and and topics in the chat around leveraging the CRM. How do you do that? What information should you be looking for? Am I getting all of the information? And in many cases, I'll tell you, and I can speak for NPT, and I would say this is very likely industry standard. A lot of the information that's probably coming with the check is maybe not always making its way to you as the frontline fundraiser. So for example, if someone is receiving a check at the office, they're the ones opening that check. There's almost always, as far as I've ever seen, a grant letter that is attached to that particular check, signaling that the who the donor is if it's not anonymous, which only 4% of grants are paid anonymously from donor advised fund, which I think might be a surprising number for many of you, because it might be anonymous by the time it gets to you because it hasn't worked its way through your CRM with all of the necessary information that can be flagged or tagged to particular donors in your system. So I would say most certainly trying to understand who's opening the checks, who's processing these checks, and how can that information start to live and breathe in your CRMs to identify who these DAF donors are. That will then help you be very, very deliberate in your marketing efforts and your appeals to try to understand not only the cadence here of what you're going to be by way of, we tend to ask folks as fundraisers to treat your DAF donors like you would treat a major gifts donor, because that's essentially what they are. So if you're going to leverage a particular cadence or for outreach for those particular donors, include your DAF donors that you've identified in those particular appeals. But I'll let others speak to actual marketing, because that's not necessarily my my forte.
Yeah, for sure. On your website, include that as one of the many ways to give. I was just on a client's website today. They had every instrument under the sun except DAF. So if you're a donor looking at it, what are you going to think? Well, they must not do it because they didn't list it. It's some of that simple stuff on your receipting stuffers, newsletters. You can say we accept DAFs. Somebody asked a question about the widget. Andrew, I think you answered the question about the widget, but even whether the widget drives more DAF giving or not, it signals you know how to work with a DAF. So that's what you want to do. You want to make sure donors know, yes, I can do that with this organization, especially if you're small, because they may be thinking as a donor, oh, this is maybe more complicated than a small organization handle. It's not. It's a check or a wire transfer. Let people know.
All right.
Jeff,
Awesome.
if I can jump in, just another piece is in terms of marketing it is to be proactive. I mean, I've got many donors who are running large businesses. Their children are not going to take over those businesses, and at some point they're going to sell. And so proactively in communicating before a liquidity event that that's an option, or if you've got the transfer of wealth generationally, talking about it proactively, even if it's years down the road, tease that person up to know at the point in time I sell my company, I'm going to be giving now through a DAF because Andrew and I have been having that conversation, or when I receive the estate gift that's planned for me, I'll be giving through a DAF if it's not already in place. So proactively is great.
Yeah.
Speaking to that, Andrew, I just saw a stat yesterday that talks about the anticipated kind of wealth transfer that's going to come specifically by way of business owners who might be selling either now or through the next 20 or so years. And we just recently saw that less than 2% of those transactions that occurred in 2024 actually had a charitable component that flowed through a donor advised fund. So that tells you an interesting story there. What incremental number is above that went directly to other charities, we're not sure of. But when it comes to that smaller sleeve, there's a lot more room there to monetize that event, which then just brings a lot of that money that's been tied up in these families for so long, because a lot of their wealth is tied up in their business, can now be deployed into the charitable sector with the M&A markets being very robust and expected to be pretty robust throughout 2025. And Jeff, I see a couple questions that I thought I might answer some of these if you don't mind.
Sure.
Someone was specifically asking how is the charity kind of having to monitor itself when it comes to a DAF gift coming, when they might be looking to support a gala or other type of event where that could be the personal benefit back to the donor. Grants that come from a donor advised fund, as Evan mentioned earlier, have to be going to a 501c3. And part of our diligence process as a DAF provider is that we have to be sure that there's no personal benefit back to the family. Even a T-shirt can be considered a potential benefit there. So one thing we have to be mindful of is when you receive those checks, another moment where you're looking at those checks and it's to support your annual gala that's happening in December, the donor will have to disclaim any benefit of attendance to that. They can pay for it on the side, but for that DAF gift, if they wanted to underwrite that particular event, they would have to be mindful of being the ones to monitor that, because the grant will specifically state that the donor has disclaimed that particular benefit there.
That's a good point. So you're saying you get a $10,000 DAF gift and it says gala, the donor would have to pay the amount for the gala or whatever the ticket price was, in
That's right.
addition to the $10,000.
That's right. And they would have to do that separately. They can't pay for that outside of the donor advised fund because that would be, even that dinner is considered a personal benefit back to them.
Yep.
Yeah. And so in your CRM, that'll come in as 2 transactions. And if they're doing it well, from a gift officer's perspective, you can see that the $120 was tied to the dinner ticket.
Yeah.
And the $10,000 is an outright gift, soft credited.
Yeah.
Got it. Andrew, do you have any suggestions for how to break through and connect with anonymous DAF donors?
Well, I think fortunately, as Fernando said, it's a very small fraction. Now, I think that's a growing fraction. So I think, again, you've got to be proactive. And I've been fortunate that I have not been ghosted, so to speak, with anonymous. I've had donors that we have relationships with who have told me, I am going to go anonymous. Or if right at this time of year, if I've had a conversation about not seeing a gift from last year that typically came from a DAF, I've had donors tell me, I'm giving through my DAF, but it's going to be anonymous. And can I continue to share the information with you? And I do, trusting that we'll have a conversation, that there may be a gift they share that they've given anonymously to support the organization. But the challenge is, and a lot of great questions, we're trying to get through them in terms of the answer box about anonymous giving. You know, my challenge is where this is receded in Texas before I see it is, and Fernando or Evan may be able to speak to this, is if it comes from, Fidelity, if it comes from Schwab and it's anonymous, I don't get the information. There's nothing in the system that tells me that gift is connected to any individual. And so it's difficult unless you just want to go out on a limb that somebody who stopped giving that hasn't told you it's anonymous, maybe giving anonymous, and you want to invest that time, hopefully stewarding them that they're continuing to give, although they won't tell you. That's a personal choice. But it's really been a challenge with it. If they are anonymous, half the time you don't see the gift if it is. And as Fernando said, it's only right now 4% of the cases. So Diane, I don't know if you want to speak to this at all, but.
Yeah, I think a lot of what goes on here on these quote unquote anonymous ones where you don't have all the information nailed down. If you're a gift officer, please hear me. Examine how much of this is really your fear of having an awkward, what you think to be as an awkward conversation with a donor, and reframe that you're honoring the donor by following up to make sure that, the credit's there and that you are able to report on impact. I think a good bit of this is fear-based. You feel stupid. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. It is goofy that you have to go through this. Suck it in. Inhale, exhale. Think about your donor and what the donor's trying to achieve and go with that positive. You get to talk to that donor again about this. You just have to get over your fear. That's blunt. I'll stop talking.
And I think it goes to the point too, Diana and Andrew, around these are new and they've been around a while, but certainly they've become more mainstream now because the administration is so easy. It's very low fee to administer these, so it's an easy vehicle for those to give by. And I think what I try to do with my clients, and something I think would be helpful for organizations as they ask, is what is the name of your donor advised fund? Many, it is their direct name. It's Evan Linhart's Donor Advised Fund, but it could be the Johnson Family Foundation. I have a client who has named it after their estate, and it's not wouldn't be directly obvious who they're giving to. So whenever I see them being built, I talk to my clients and I say, make sure it's identifiable, because when they get it, they're going to just get that top line. So it is a new muscle for donors to understand and to flex around what's the best way so that you get it. So I think it's just partly now, as an organization, thinking about your donors, asking them about donor advised funds, but asking them what the name of their donor advised fund is, because they have to name it, to have that account name.
Yeah, and speaking a little bit more to the anonymity of some of the grants that you may receive, I cover DC, and in some cases in that market, that's a pretty anonymous town, as you might imagine. So sometimes these folks 100% do want to support charities, and they don't want more appeals, or they don't want their name in lights. They for whatever reason they might be wanting to give anonymously. That's why the option is there for them. But that small percentage leads me to believe that there's just a lot more meat on that bone to ask these questions. These, as Diana was mentioning earlier, it kind of just rung so true with me when I was thinking about, yeah, the fear-based piece of that. Just asking the question, it gives you an opportunity to even just reach out to that person if you had no other reason to reach out in that case anyway. I would also mention something that I've seen happening a good bit throughout the country in my coverage area, especially, where the nonprofits themselves are getting their largest donors in a room, and they might bring someone like Evan into the room to come and talk about trust, giving through a trust. And someone else might come in and talk about giving by way of life insurance. Someone else like me might come in and talk about giving through a donor advised fund. It's a wine and cheese event, but you want to just get your largest donors in the room to show we are trying to give you, donor, the best possible ways to give to us and the ideas in this room. And inevitably, at least 50% of the time when I've given those conversations or been at those conversations, the hand gets raised saying, are these new? And as Evan mentioned, they've been around a long time. DAFs have actually been in the tax code since the 1930s. But the 90s is really where they started to gain traction. One other question that was in the chat that I noticed, which was around pledges. I will tell you that about 3-4 years ago, the IRS came out with guidance that yes, a DAF can make a grant toward a pledge. The DAF just cannot reference the pledge in the actual letter or the check. So just know that not all DAF providers will fulfill a pledge through a donor advised fund, but the guidance is out there from the IRS that yes, a donor advised fund can be used to fulfill a pledge. And you can find that on the IRS website directly. So,
Okay, let's get to some more questions. We have a ton of them. So first one I want to ask to the group here is, can you talk about the tax implications for the donor when choosing a DAF over other giving vehicles? Anyone want to answer that?
I can start, and a donor advised fund is going to afford a donor the same tax deduction that they would get if they were giving to your organization. So they're going to get that up to 30% of AGI for anything that's non-cash and up to 60% for a cash gift. So the donor advised fund is a 501c3 public charity, which is why they will be affording them that. The big difference between a donor advised fund and your charity, which offers programs, is that a donor advised fund cannot receive QCDs. So that's another reason you can reach out to your donors directly and ask for those QCDs on an annual basis. And so we are excluded from being able currently to accept those QCDs. So just know that that's the qualified charitable deduction or distribution from a retirement account, just so you're aware, for those folks who want to directly pass through those funds to your organization. If they're giving to a private foundation, obviously they're going to get less favorable tax treatment than they would for a donor advised fund or to giving to your organization directly.
Yeah, and many of these donor advised funds, just to piggyback on that, Fernando, they're set up to one of the earlier points about business sale, inflow of new money, because there's a large tax implication, and they have not set up their family mission statement, their charitable budget, but they want to get the tax deduction in that year in which they have a big gain event. So they put it into a donor advised fund, take some time to get their structure set up, and then can get that money out over 1, 2, 3, 4 years, rather than having that decision to be made right at that moment. So it gives them that time to plan, but they get that tax deduction in that first moment they give, because as Fernando said, it's a 501c3 on its own set. So that's a major benefit. Some people have foundations. There's pros to the foundations. Maybe you get less of a tax deduction, but you can pay a family member to run your foundation, right? There's some other reasons around foundations why it might be, and different ways to administer, different places you can give. So it's always a conversation of what's best for what the family's trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good point, Evan. There's one other piece that I will say that this has happened a lot recently, especially in those business scenarios where a donor might be looking to support their alma mater, for example, and they've reached out to that alma mater. Let's not use alma mater. Let's say a small private school, for example, and they have a very small operating budget, as you might imagine, especially as compared to a large national charity. But the donor would like to make a very meaningful impact to that charity. Now, the last thing that donor wants to do is push that charity out of public support. So they might actually have a really a valid reason to leverage a donor advised fund to spread that funding out over 5-10 years by giving that larger initial gift to the donor advised fund administrator, and then getting those funds out on a more recurring basis, even by way of a grant agreement. They can go through and get that done. That way, they can count those on their books. But it'll spread that out so as not to affect the charity's charitable status.
Yep. Evan, this one might be for you. Can an organization be a beneficiary of a DAF if a donor has no family to oversee the account after they pass?
Yes, so Fernando can definitely answer this question, but yes, you can name a beneficiary of your donor advised fund, family member or someone who you want to keep it going, or an organization. Now, there's some that don't list that, and I believe, Fernando, that then would, after a certain amount of time, get into a pool if there's no. But Fernando, maybe you want to clarify some.
Yeah, it'll vary by the DAF administrator, but for example, at National Philanthropic Trust, you get three options. You would be able to name those individuals as successors. You could name a charity to get lump sums upon your passing, or you can have a bit more of an endowment option for certain sized of accounts where you can set it to where the charity is going to get a percentage of the account in perpetuity until the funds are exhausted. So those are three options. I will tell you, if they have no legacy plan on their donor advised fund, our policy is probably very similar to others. We're first going to look at that donor's grant making history and leverage that list as our way to get the funds out the door. If they opened that yesterday, had no grant making history, and unfortunately passed away, we'd be between a rock and a hard place, and those funds would go into our giving fund, not to our operational funds, but into our giving funds, where we could then make those grants at the discretion of our board. So there's probably a combination of that at every donor advised fund administrator in the country.
Awesome. Here's one, and maybe Andrew or Diana can answer this one. Is it meaningful to code or mark donors in the CRM as a DAF donor and then cultivate them separately with a unique email or mailer? It said we currently hard credit and soft credit gifts from a DAF, but we do not have those donors segmented separately.
Where I've seen CRM support this, where there's either a checkoff box or there's a drop-down field and they can actually put which donor advised fund the donor uses. It's helpful when you want to do messaging and you want to know, yes, it's on the soft credit part of your CRM, but if if there's a discrete field on the donor record, it is easier and faster to do some kind of communication. So you might send all your donor advised fund donors a message on October 1. And if you're a gift officer, it's just easier to get there. But that's really kind of the extent of it. I don't think you need a separate communication plan per se. It should be part of your marketing communications in general. But in relationship fundraising, if you're a major gift officer, a mid-level officer, or a planned giving officer, those are individual conversations you're having and you're learning as you understand how they choose to give philanthropically. But one thing that is helpful, if there's a code that says they use a DAF, you know they're philanthropic. Whether they give $50 a month,
yes,
$1,000 a month, $25,000 a year, or a $500,000 one-time ever gift. That helps you understand this donor thinks differently about their philanthropy. That's strategy.
Yep.
And Jeff, I agree with Diana in terms of not necessarily needing to separate it out for communication marketing purposes per se, but I do think in terms of your CRM, if it's robust enough that you can have that information there within the record so you understand who the hard credit sponsor is while you see the soft credit that you're stewarding, and then you can run reports of who you have in terms of those hard credit DAFs, many times through the same name, but many times, at least from where the check comes, it just helps you clue in and remember, right, they're giving through a DAF. If that's not already in their record, which I put it in the narrative and make sure it's in their record because, it's just one of the smaller things that's helpful to be aware of.
So I realize on a donor record, you're fighting for real estate all the time for what information is going to be there. That's a pretty important piece of information.
Yeah. So this is kind of, I kind of feel for this person to ask the question. And I know Diana or Andrew, you can help this person a lot. But they said they've been getting DAF money for years and they always hard credit the donor and no credit to the sponsor. So how do we change this? Do we just change it moving forward or we change it retroactively? What do you recommend?
Well, definitely change it going forward because it's incorrect to
Yeah.
hard credit the donor. That's an IRS implication. If that donor ever gets audited and comes through to you, it's going to be a quagmire.
Right.
If you have the bandwidth to do it retroactively, I do think it's a smart forensic cleaning up of your CRM. But understand the donor gave to the DAF. The DAF is a 501c3. That is where the IRS documentation comes from. You soft credit the donor and they get an acknowledgement letter from you. That communicates to the donor that, yes, you understand the gift came through, you're thankful, and you can report on impact. Very critical. I'm kind of surprised you're not flagged in an audit on that from your external auditing firm.
Okay. This might be a simple one, but how often can a person put money into their DAF and get a tax benefit? Is it every year, or how does it work?
Every day if they'd like. Honestly, there's no limit on how much. Obviously, they want to be able to be sure that if they have a tax reason for giving, that they'd want to make sure that they're not over giving into the donor advised fund, just as they would to any other type of charity, that they can leverage the entire deduction over the next couple of years. I'm sorry, Evan, that was most definitely something more appropriate for you.
Nope, that's right. That's right.
This goes to pledges. Why is it that DAF gifts are not supposed to be used to fulfill a pledge?
Yeah, and that's really not the case anymore. They used to be specifically precluded from that, but with that new guidance over the past couple of years, you can look for the IRS code specifically there. And what I'll do, Jeff and Diana, I'll share that the link to that page on the IRS website for you after this.
And that was a helpful distinction. The reason was, in theory, you can't control the future. You've already given the gift to the donor advised fund. You cannot bind the donor advised fund to future gifts on a pledge. Right. That was the rationale. But in practice, it was and the IRS addressed it, I think, after a lot of people going, what?
Yeah. And they're thinking about a lot of things to either loosen or kind of put some more barriers around.
Okay, so here's one. I've heard this one a lot. Don't the DAFs have a financial incentive to hold on to funds instead of encouraging disbursements? What would you guys say to that?
I mean, there's no real incentive. Go ahead, Evan.
No, I mean, look, we do a lot of financial forecasting and modeling on, if your DAF assets or personal assets grow, what could be your total philanthropic value, meaning how much can you give over time? And if you let your assets grow, eventually there's going to be a point where the growth and the distribution cumulatively will be more. But most people are putting their assets into a DAF because they want to give it out. And that's, again, the vehicle in which they're doing it too. So every DAF, just like every foundation or person, has their own philanthropic mission. Some want to give the money out every year or every other year to make sure it's going out the door and it's getting to the crisis and issues that they care about. Others want this to be in perpetuity so they can pass it down to their family. So it really just depends on what that family or individual is hoping to achieve personally from their philanthropy. It's something we help them try to articulate and think about. But most of the donors DAF holders that I work with are looking to get the money out the door in a 3 to 5 year period, let it grow in the meantime. But I do have many families that use it more of the way we would think of a traditional foundation, where it's in perpetuity, and they're looking to make this a way to get their next generation involved, and it'll be passed down, and they're going to continue to give. So they want it to grow as they're giving, and they're giving 7 to 10% or more out of their donor advised fund every year to keep it moving with the markets.
Okay. Let's go for our final question here. And this one is just, what is some helpful basic reading to become informed about DAFs for an MGO? What should they be reading?
I'll start right now that there's, if you go to our website, I don't mean for this to be a commercial for NPT, but nptrust.org, and there's a section called For Nonprofits. There's a whole reading list there that'll give you not just the understanding of the DAF universe, but the technical side of DAFs, also the trends of how folks are giving and everything too. It's a great place to start.
Yeah, I use it to send it to my clients, so I'll give you a commercial for that, Fernando. It's good stuff. It's actionable.
Right.
It's actionable.
Get familiar with that whole website. Frankly, it's very, very helpful.
Excellent.
Yeah, Jeff, and one last thing. I mean, obviously you've got those publications that are out there, but simply just Google. I mean, I think you'll find information from Stanford, from Notre Dame, from a lot of, studies that are out there that are 50 pages long that will tell you everything you want to know and more about a DAF.
Yeah. Well, Fernando, Diana, Evan, Andrew, thank you so much for lending your expertise. This has been a great webinar. I mean, so many amazing questions. And for you who have been listening, thank you for being with us today. As a reminder, you're going to receive a recording of this webinar, because there are a lot of questions about that, and a copy of the slides via email tomorrow. So look out for that. We'll also be sharing additional resources and ways you can connect with our guests in a follow-up email. So be on the lookout for all of that. And as always, we're here to support you in all of your relationship fundraising efforts. So if you have other questions, please don't hesitate to ask, and take care. Have a great afternoon, everyone.